Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. With his loss in round 4 ending his perfect winning streak, Lasker has given up sole first and now takes only shared first in round number 5 of the Amsterdam 1889 tournament. Isidore Gunsberg and James Mason have caught up to him, all on 3 out of 4. Emo Spurn and Louis Van Vliet only being half a point behind, but having taken a bye earlier in the tournament, should certainly be included in that leading pack as well. Now, while those gentlemen duke it out to determine their standing in the pecking order, Lasker potentially has the advantage of facing one of the tail enders of the tournament at the moment, Robinson Leather. Leather is not super active as a chess player, he's a poet by profession. I'll leave a link to a blog post by the Ilkley Chess Club down in the description. They talk a little bit more about his poetry career and about some of his side chess exploits. Be warned that, again, the results of this tournament are spoiled, so read with caution. The question arises then, how did he get an invite to this tournament? And I believe that it's a similar situation as in the previous round with Louis Van Vliet, in that Leather got an invite from a close friend and teammate, Emo Spurn. Now, Byrne is a very well-respected international player, and the two of them have been teammates ever since 1881, competing for the Liverpool Chess Club. You can see them in the left-hand column here. It would make sense that Byrne, being such an accomplished player, would have some sway with the organizing committee, much like Rudolf Lohmann. I've seen it hypothesized that Leather was set to take part in the Hauptturnier, and that he only got elevated when it was rumored that Joseph Blackburn would be completing. Again, I have no hard evidence of this. This is just what I've heard, so take it all with a grain of salt. Outside of these Liverpool Chess Club matches, what exactly has Leather been up to? The answer is not all that much. I found him competing in the 1883 Counties Chess Association tournament, which was sort of a subdivision of the British Chess Association. He came third in his group, which I imagine is quite good. So you can imagine that he's a very respectable national level player, perhaps not at the same caliber as these players, as is evidenced by his current score. But, you know, anything can happen in these tournaments. That's about all I'd like to talk about with him. I think it's about time we get into the chess. Mr. Leather, with the white pieces, opens with a somewhat rarer move, knight to c3. Now, as a little bit of trivia, in all but one of his white games, Leather started with knight to c3, and in every single one of his black games, he started with knight to c6. He's certainly consistent. Lasker responds with d5. We have g3, knight to f6, bishop to g2, and now c5 from Lasker. d3, e6, and here Leather plays the move e4, and with this we've transposed more or less to a closed Sicilian. More specifically, this line is known as the Korchnoi defense. Now, Black's most popular moves in this particular variation are the simple developing moves bishop to e7 and knight to c6. Another reasonable option that's been played a handful of times is d captures on e4. White's best bet has been to accept that the queens are going to get traded. Queen captures on d1, knight captures d1, and now, for example, knight to c6. This is all fairly reasonable stuff. But Lasker ensures that we remain well outside the realms of theory with h6. Leather continues with knight g to e2, and now we're already in a position where there are very few games. I found one game in the database where d captures on e4 was played on this move, and in this particular game, White avoided the queen trade by playing knight captures on e4. Knight captures e4 and bishop captures on e4. This was played by Olga Sabirova against Martha Mateus in the 2008 Olympiad. White would go on to win this game, though I should say that the results of avoiding the queen trade have overwhelmingly flavored Black. Of course, they do tend to play more impactful moves than h6, mind you. But Lasker does not trade here on e4. He instead plays the engine's absolute favorite move, d4. This move is a novelty, so it's as of move 6 that the players are playing a unique game. This move more or less forces Leather to retreat his knight all the way back to b1. We have bishop to d7 and now f4, very nice expansion. Bishop to c6, you might as well contest the long diagonal. The knight gets redeveloped to d2. We have knight b to d7, knight to f3, and bishop to e7 from Lasker. Both players certainly have a respectable amount of space, though neither of them can really adopt any ambitious developing plans yet. For example, White doesn't really have the option of this pawn break in c3, trying to get rid of this annoying pawn, as after you trade here on c3, knight captures on c3, Black gets a lot of very easy queenside play starting with b5. You know, b4 is coming, a5 next, and it's just very free queenside expansion for basically nothing. White doesn't have to allow this if they don't want to. So Leather, not seeing much of an alternative, simply waits with h3. Okay. Queen to c7 from Lasker, and now a3. Rook to d8 and even b3. So Leather certainly not very comfortable in this position. He's not really found any reasonable way to develop his pieces. Lasker, on the other hand, does now start to get a little bit of ambition, starting with knight to h7, of course freeing his f-pawn. After Leather castles, we indeed see f5. The e-pawn is under attack. How does Leather properly answer this? The most direct option certainly does make some sense. You can trade here on f5, e captures f5, e captures f5, and now rook to e1. Looks quite strong, taking advantage of the king in the center, but black is actually quite content simply playing king to f7. And after you develop the bishop, let's say to d2, rook h to e8 comes, king to g8 can be played whenever black feels like their king is in danger, and I don't really think they're suffering any problems here. The tournament book seems to prefer the move knight to d2, which makes sense. You add 2 defenders to the e4 pawn, and after this knight returns to the game through f6, they continue with bishop to b2, and I can sort of see the reasoning behind this, though I struggle to think of any super active plans for white after black simply castles. The black king looks a lot safer, so I can imagine that it'll actually be black looking to trade on e4, push e5, and try to open things up. This seems a little bit awkward for white. Leather ultimately decides on the move knight to e1, which accomplishes something similar, opening up the bishop's defense of the pawn, though the problem here is that after knight h to f6, now the move he has to play here in order to keep everything under control is e5. This is not a move that I went over in the previous variation because it just gives up control of the d5 square. In the other line, it would probably be this knight moving from b6 to d5, but here Lasker is able to put his knight on d5 in one move, so take that as you will. Bishop to d2 and castles were the next moves played, and I think it's safe to say that Lasker has won this opening battle. Leather has shown difficulty coming up with a development scheme in this rather closed and uneventful position, while Lasker has put every piece into the game in some capacity. Still, with no trades having occurred yet, the board is still very cluttered, and as such, I don't think it's safe to say that there's much of a tangible advantage yet. Leather continues by playing the move king to h2, why not, defend some of these weak pawns, and now rook to f7 from Lasker. Here we have b4, and Lasker keeps things closed with b6. This knight comes back to f3, as there's nothing more going on in the e4 square, and Lasker decides to move his knight back to f8. It's ironic that such a blocked position is actually not great for this knight, but that's indeed the case. Tucking it away for now is sensible. It'll come back out when it's not blocking his other pieces, and we'll see very quickly that the d7 square will be needed for something other than the knight. Queen to e1 was played here by Leather, and Lasker takes advantage of this now undefended c-pawn by playing bishop to a4, giving it a little tickle. Rook to c1 defends, and now Lasker takes advantage of the vacated d7 square, puts his queen there. Why not? Get it out of the rook's gaze. Leather moves his king back to h1, and now rook to c8 from Lasker. Now I'd like to point out that this is black's 23rd move, and only now do we get our first trade of the game on move 24, b captures on c5. There's nothing notable about this, that's just our first capture. After b captures on c5, here Leather comes up with a very good shot, c4. This practically forces d captures on c3 en passant, and after knight captures on c3, Lasker has no way to maintain his excellent knight here on d5, so he trades it off. Knight captures c3, and rook captures on c3. So here, Leather has left Lasker with a couple of isolated pawns, in exchange for having to babysit his own weak backwards pawn on d3. Lasker still has the slightly better pieces, however, so it's hard to say if this is really an equalizing measure here by Leather. Here, Lasker comes up with a very devious move, bishop to d8. This is going to force a whole lot more simplification, and one that more or less favors Lasker. After queen to c1, really ganging up here on the c-pawn, Lasker plays the move bishop to a5. This forces rook captures on c5, and now we have a lot more trades. Bishop captures d2, knight captures d2, rook captures c5, queen captures c5, and finally, Lasker retakes here on d3. This comes with an attack on the knight, so Leather plays a very efficient move, queen to b4, defending the knight and attacking the bishop at the same time, and now it's Lasker who has to answer the question, what do you do here? Lasker opts for the move bishop to c2, which is certainly fine, but I think that there's a slightly trickier move order you could play here. If you start with the move rook to d7, which is what Lasker plays next, Leather sort of loses this option of playing his knight to f3, getting it out of danger, because bishop to c6 comes, and this pressure looks a little bit too dicey for me. And so if you want to trade here, you can. Queen captures a4 and queen captures on d2 is reasonable. I can't see black having any trouble in this endgame. This rook is quickly going to infiltrate the position, ideally on d2, And with most of the pawns being on one side of the board, the knight should be the preferable piece. It still needs to get into the game, of course, but the position is simplified that there will be more than enough time for that. The problem with bishop to c2, I think, is that after Leather plays the move rook to c1, now rook to d7 is pretty toothless because knight to f3 comes, and white is really not suffering too much in this position. So what do you do here as Lasker? He opts for this move that should come as no surprise to anyone by this point, g5. The tournament book calls this a good and energetic move. I'm not sure if I agree with that. We have to analyze, of course, the most direct variation, which is simply f captures on g5. And after h captures on g5, g4 is a very annoying threat. You, of course, don't want to take this because your own g-pawn falls. So I think that it's very reasonable for white to just play g4 themselves. And it's very difficult to avoid even further simplification. For example, the computer seems to favor the move a5, which does temporarily just give away a pawn. Queen captures a5, f captures g4, knight captures g5, g captures h3, and knight captures on h3. But all is not lost. Of course, the pawn is going to get regained very easily through queen to d4, and knight to g6 will come. This pawn is going to fall, and it'll be completely even. Of course, white doesn't have access to rook captures on c2 because queen to d1 simply wins the exchange for nothing. But overall, I can't believe that this endgame following this pawn being recaptured offers black much of anything. Leather did not trade, however. He instead decided to keep his options open by first playing the move queen to c5. Okay, why not? You've got a double attack here on this bishop. You need to resolve this as black. Lasker moves it down to d1, and now rook to c3, hitting the queen. Queen slides down to b1, and after rook to c1, now the queen goes to b2. In this particular instance, Lasker here threatens bishop captures on f3 and rook to d2, which would be a very annoying position for Leather to defend. So how do you deal with that? Again, I believe that f captures on g5 makes a lot of sense. Here, bishop captures on f3 as threatened leads to bishop captures on f3, and now rook to d2 is certainly a move, but I think rook to d3 is slightly more important. Rook to f1 is required to defend this, and now h captures on g5. Okay, material is completely equal. White can continue forcing pawns off the board by playing queen to e7, where after queen captures on e5, queen captures on g5 comes with check, and now it's in black's best interest to block with the queen. And now white can trade queens and play this endgame and try to argue that their outside pass pawn is going to be more impactful than black's passed e-pawn, or you can try to keep them on with queen to c1. Either way, it's certainly a game from here. Leather instead decides to trade queens here with queen to c3, and unfortunately for him, this leads to a sequence that drops him a pawn. Queen captures on c3 was played, rook captures on c3, and now bishop captures on f3 as telegraphed. Bishop captures f3, g captures f4, g captures on f4, and now rook to d4. Now this does win a pawn, although in this particular variation, Leather actually still has ways to defend. If you want it to be surgically precise, it's now time to bring the knight into the game with knight to g6. This also attacks the f4 pawn, and if white tries to defend it with rook to c4, now the rook is able to infiltrate on d3, and there's so much valuable stuff here on the third rank that black is going to win at least one pawn. But Lasker instead decided to win the pawn right away with rook to d4, and now things get a little bit tricky. Bishop to h5 from Leather. We have rook captures on f4, and now rook to c7, very aggressive. Here comes rook to e4, and now, of course, you don't want to be taking this thing right away and allowing Lasker to have two passed pawns connected in the center, so bishop to f7 with check. We have king to h8, and now you certainly have the option of taking this. Leather makes a little bit of a mistake playing rook to c8. After rook captures on e5, you don't have access to rook captures on f8 here because king to g7, and you're going to win back the piece anyway, so that would be a waste. But he does get access to bishop captures on e6. Lasker keeps the fight alive with king to g7. We have rook to c7 with check, and now king to f6. So here we see that Lasker is still up a pawn, but not all hope is lost. Leather still has ways to survive this. Now the tournament book correctly points out that rook to f7 check doesn't work for white, although their particular line is wrong. Their line starts with king captures on e6, and after rook captures on f8, rook to a5, rook to h8, rook captures on a3, rook captures on h6 with check, and king to e5. And they say that this endgame wins for black, though strictly speaking, it's a table-based draw. Black could very well win this, however, but it's incorrect to say that it is winning for black. King to g6 is the proper move, and the issue here is that this bishop never really finds a stable point. If you move it back, let's say to c4, the rook will go to c5 and attack it, and at some point it's going to end up on the third rank here, where again, the rook is going to hit the third rank, and it's going to pick up something here along the third rank. Black's going to just pick up another pawn with a completely winning endgame. So white has to play the move bishop to c8. And now, okay, this takes away the a6 square from the a pawn, so a5 keeps black material ahead. But now h4, very important move, taking away the g5 square from the black king. Now let's say the knight gets into the game, knight to g6, going after the pawn. We have rook to c6 with check. The king moves up, let's say king f7, rook to c7 with check. And now, of course, black has the option to repeat, but why would they? They're going to block with knight e7, and now white can start getting their king into the game with king to g2, and the game goes on. Black will, of course, have all of the winning chances being up a pawn, but it's still a game. Unfortunately for Leather, the move he decided on was not a game. He decided to sacrifice with bishop captures on f5, and this loses without offering much resistance at all. We have rook captures on f5 and rook captures on a7, but of course Lasker simply plays rook to f2. And now black basically has two extra pieces. He's up a knight, and this king is never going to get into the game, and it's not very hard for him to win. Thankfully, Leather doesn't drag things on too long. He plays the move rook to a4, and now finally Lasker plays knight to g6. Lasker put the knight on f8 back on move 20, and now he finally moves it again exactly on move 50. Very interesting. Anyway, king to g1, rook to a2, the rest of this isn't very interesting. King to f1, rook to h2, king to g1, and rook captures on h3. King to g2, rook to b3, king to h2, and now Lasker gets his king involved. King to g5, rook back to a8, and after king to g4, it was here on move 56 that Robinson Leather resigned the game. So yeah, definitely not the highest quality game ever. Lasker was never really in trouble. Leather failed to come up with any sort of active development scheme. We saw here h3, a3, b3, and he just never got anything going. Lasker's play, of course, wasn't like the most precise. Like here, if he'd have played rook to d7, then I think he would have been able to develop a winning advantage faster. But what he did ultimately paid off. I still don't know what precisely Leather was hoping to get in this position. I guess he assumed it must have been lost. Otherwise, why would you go for this completely desperate sack of bishop captures on f5? But ultimately, that was not the correct choice. So with that, Lasker's on 4 out of 5. He guarantees himself at least shared first place going into round number 6. But what a final tournament he will have. Over the next 4 rounds, he will have one bye, and he will have to face the 3 international masters, Günzburg, Mason, and Bern. So if you thought that his winning ways meant anything up until this point, I would ask you to curb your expectations. We're going to have the most important games of the tournament yet coming up. I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.